John Santiago here, host of the Videocraft show presented by Husky, a video podcast designed to help you become a more business savvy creator. Now, are you stumped for ideas on how to build a business model for yourself as a creator? Well, in this episode, this conversation may actually help you spark ideas of your own. Simon Owens, who is this week's guest, is a longtime journalist, marketer, and PR professional, and he's built an audience for himself covering the creator economy. Now, his main platforms are his newsletter and his podcast, and his newsletter actually reaches just about 5,000 subscribers, while his podcast generates around 1,000 downloads per episode. In this edition of the Videocraft show presented by Video Husky, I chat with Simon about a host of subjects around his business model as a creator, including what he charged for consulting services when he offered them, how he partnered with the University of Oregon to launch an online course, and how he sells ads on his podcast and newsletter, and so much more. So let's not waste any time and just jump straight into my conversation with Simon Owens. So I really want to talk to you about all different kinds of things in regards to, building a creator business. Obviously, you are a creator yourself, but I often start these conversations with just a general overview of, the guest's own story and their own path to kind of building their own creator business. And I know that you have a background in journalism. Obviously, the way that you cover the media business is very much in that journalistic tone and style. So can you kind of just walk me through your history and your background in media?
Yeah, it's actually probably longer than most. I first started getting interested in online publications going all the way back into when I was in high school in the 90s. Freshman, sophomore year, I started getting interested in these things called webzines or e-zines, they called them back then. And
the early blogs, basically.
So
precursor to blogs.
Sort of, yeah. I forget what year Blogger came around, but I certainly didn't know what blogs were back then, but I knew what webzines were. A lot of them were built on very kind of simple templates like GeoCities and stuff like that. And I was like a short fiction writer. So I would submit my short stories to these zines. And I just found it so cool that you could publish stuff to the internet and you didn't need to, and it was basically free and there were no gatekeepers and stuff like that. So that was my initial fascination. And then in 2003, when I was a freshman in college, I started my first blog and it was mainly just kind of like a personal type blog that I was going for several years. And then in 2000, my senior year of college, I started my first blog that I was actually trying to write for a mass audience. It was called Blogasm. And it was kind of the idea was just interviewing other bloggers and just kind of writing about the ecosystem of the blogosphere. And then after I graduated college, I was lucky that I graduated pre-recession. And, when there were still jobs in newspapers and basically just started shooting out my resume. I had no job skills whatsoever. I had a little bit of experience working on my college magazine, but that was it. One of those resumes that I shot out landed at a newspaper that was hiring. They brought me on. I had to learn how to be a newspaper journalist basically from scratch, but I learned really valuable skills. And I started applying those skills to my blog. And then started doing original reporting for Blogasm and stuff like that. And Blogasm started really taking off and getting linked to by all these other blogs. And then I was being interviewed by the New York Times or going on the radio and stuff like that. But this was before journalists could have blogs. So I was hiding the fact that I had this blog and sneaking out of my newsroom to go do these interviews and stuff like that. And I actually got in trouble with one of my editors, and basically they threatened to fire me if I didn't stop blogging during the work week. So anyway, long story short is I've been kind of doing internet media stuff for a while. But starting in 2008, I kind of started jumping back and forth between the media industry and the marketing industry. So working for various marketing agencies, And then I was an editor at U.S. News and World Report. And the reason that was kind of formative for me is because I started understanding the business side of content, understanding like how to charge clients, like marketing, like brands and stuff to do their marketing and create content for them and stuff like that. So that really kind of opened my eyes. And then in 2014, I basically quit my job and basically launched my one-man marketing, content marketing consulting business. So I would, anytime I wasn't working on client work, I was creating my own content, kind of like the output that you see from me today, these interviews and case studies with successful media operators. And I use that as a form of kind of like lead generation. So people would land on those articles, click on my bio, and then want to hire me to basically run their content marketing for them. So I basically built up like a decent 6-figure business, just from doing that. I think it's similar to what you're doing with, Video Husky and stuff like that. And was just doing that for several years. So, but anytime I was not working on client work, I was working on my own content and was slowly building up a newsletter audience and all that kind of stuff. And that eventually led in 2020, I had built up enough of a list and had been dreaming of kind of being this like independent content creator, that I basically stopped all my content consulting and focused on my newsletter and podcast full time. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
So what were the indicators for you, or I guess like the benchmarks for you that made you feel comfortable with walking away from the content marketing consulting business? Because as you mentioned, you had gotten to a point where it was generating 6 figures for yourself, and to kind of go all into just being like an independent creator, an independent publisher, there is obviously some risk in that. So I'm kind of curious, like what made you feel confident enough to take that leap?
Well, I think I had already kind of built up that kind of stamina, that propensity for risk. Because it's not like I was able to immediately transition towards making a full-time living as a content creator. In fact, it was like jumping off a cliff. It was like going from, decent middle-class income to almost no money whatsoever. And for the first like 12 plus months, I was not making very much money at all. And so I wish I could tell you that I had been building up this like huge email list, and then I made the transition right at the right time and had the perfect business model in place. But it really was like starting from scratch, even though I had been creating content for years and years and years. And I kind of talk about this in my newsletter a little bit, is about, having the runway to like build up that audience and slowly experiment with monetization. And that's what I had to do. So I really don't have a good answer for you, because I really did just jump off that cliff and just have to figure out, as I was falling towards the ground, how to build this media company from scratch.
Gotcha. I want to go back to some of the things you mentioned about your experiences in journalism and then transitioning into marketing. It's interesting to me that you mentioned you were working with U.S. News and Report,
U.S. News and World Report, yeah.
U.S. News and World Report, and then also diving into marketing at the same time. Because I also used to work in journalism myself, and one of the things that you're kind of taught when you enter that industry is like there's a very clear, distinct line between business and content, and the content people, the journalists, should never cross that line, because then it has the potential to influence or sully the work of just getting the truth or the objective truth of the story. Was there ever, did you ever have any like reservations about that? Like when you were considering jumping into the world of marketing, like did that ever cross your mind as to like, well, I'm a journalist, so am I selling out by jumping into marketing? Because you often get that from like a lot of like hardcore journalists, that they don't want to be salespeople, they don't want to be marketers, they just want to be storytellers and purveyors of the objective truth.
Yeah. So to be clear, when I was at U.S. News and World Report, I wasn't doing any marketing consulting. So I was working at a marketing agency. Then I got hired at U.S. News and World Report. I was there for about 2 years. And then I went to another marketing agency afterwards. But to the point that you're talking about, I've talked a little bit about this in my newsletter, is like the modern day journalist who, if they want to make a decent living, they really need to get out of that mindset of, this is pure journalism and this this is something that's subpar advertising. And especially if you want to have a freelance career, you really want to find that nice mixture of doing stuff that pays the bills. And that often is content marketing, copywriting, things on behalf of brands, and, then freelancing for the publications that have the prestige, but don't necessarily, pay that much, and kind of balancing between those two. And obviously you need to avoid conflicts of interest. If you have a client, you can't write about them at least without disclosure for the publication, but you really need to, I think the modern day freelance journalist, there's this, I don't know how true it is, but there's this image of the 1990s magazine journalists who get paid $3 a word to write 4 articles a year for the Atlantic or the New Yorker or whatever, and they make a 6-figure income. I think for the vast majority of freelance journalists, that's like out the window, but you can still make those decently high per word rates by doing content marketing, and then maybe make a little bit less when you're working on your, occasional more prestige, journalism pieces and stuff like that. So I definitely think that's a balance that a lot of modern day journalists need to learn how to strike.
Yeah, exactly. It's like like a lot of people who maybe pursue creative careers, is there's no real shame in having something that can sustain you, that's sustainable, right? Like to be able to fund like the creative pursuit. I don't know if you've ever read the book Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert, but this is something that she talked about before she like landed her big break, I think writing for it might have been Esquire or if it was GQ magazine, but she talks about like she was willing to do whatever it took, like to pay the bills, and then once those bills are paid, she still had the time to write. And so that's one of the things, like you mentioned, that a lot of journalists struggle to come to terms with and to come to grips with, but it's something that needs to be done. And in this world now where really where all the rules are being rewritten as we speak.
Yeah. And I think like as content marketing, inbound marketing, as that industry matures, you're starting to see like enough blending of the two where you could like, there are content marketers now who are doing like really creative journalism on behalf of their brands, where they're not writing about the brand. So it's not ad copy, but it's like genuinely good journalism that's living on the brand's website, but they're able to do like actually, really creative things. So I think like that's where, a lot of these industries are heading, where like every single company is becoming a de facto media company. So there's just like a lot of opportunity there if you're someone who's flexible and isn't too rigid, and what you are too elitist in terms of what kind of content or who you're willing to write for.
Yeah. I wonder though, sometimes with the lines being so blurred, like there of course can be some negative ramifications there to that. Like you look at, for example, like Andreessen Horowitz, big venture capital firm, they've basically started their own media company, and they can essentially cover the startup world and the technology world from their own lens. And there's still like a need to have journalists out there to keep them, checked and in balance. But with everybody now being able to kind of, pick up their own megaphone and build their own following themselves, like that's one of the difficult things in like the world that we live in, is like, who can you actually trust? Are they actually sincere about the things that they're saying, or is there like a deeper intention here ultimately to like sell you on some sort of vision, be it like Web3 or some product that they're trying to push?
Yeah, there was so much hand wringing when they launched that media arm of their company, and I think that was a little bit overblown. Like, oh, they were just going to completely bypass the entire tech journalism. The tech journalism is going to be fine. There's always going to be need for independent coverage of the tech sector. But I think companies need to find new ways to gain attention that goes beyond just sending press releases to journalists and hope that the journalist calls. Like, yeah, a good PR strategy is good, but like you really have to start, in order to get noticed. There's just so much noise. You have to develop your own media strategy. And I think, it's kind of inspiring what Andreessen Horowitz is doing. And, it's really cool to see more and more companies devote like a sizable portion of their budget to, creating their own media rather than just spending so much money on paid media.
Right. Yeah, because there's nothing like actual storytelling and whatnot to actually, draw somebody into into what it is that you're creating. Let's talk more about your newsletter and the structure of it. You publish a few times a week. I think you do like around 2 articles a week. You do two podcasts a month. How did you decide to come to that structure for yourself? Like, was this just a matter of your saying to yourself, okay, this is sustainable for me. This is what I can do in the over the long haul. And if you ever had any challenges with maybe deciding to do more or do less in terms of content creation.
Yeah. So I do, one newsletter that's sent out per week, every single Wednesday. And then I do these. So it's kind of, the land is kind of shifting between our feet, but I'm going to kind of talk generally about the content output. So there's the 4 newsletters per month, 1 per week. And then I do 2 long form podcast interviews per month. And then I take those podcast interviews, I take the transcripts, and I do additional research, and I create case studies out of those long form podcast interviews. And those case studies will range anywhere from like 2,000 to 4,000 words. So ideally, I'm kind of pulling all this together, but a podcast episode, an audio version of the podcast episode, a video version of the podcast episode, and the long form case study article will go live on the same day. So there's just like a lot of different ways you can consume that content. And before it was kind of haphazard and I was just publishing stuff as I kind of finished it. But what got me on a more regular schedule was basically when I launched sponsorships. So that's when I had to have, a day every single week that something comes out, or the exact dates that the podcast was going out, because I was basically selling scarcity, that only 1 sponsorship per newsletter, only 1 sponsorship for podcasts. In order for people to book those sponsorships, they needed to know when those newsletters and podcasts were coming out so I could have a schedule. So that's when I got more disciplined about, making sure that those go out every Wednesday for the newsletter and every other Wednesday for the podcast. And every now and then I'll send it out on Thursday instead of Wednesday, but generally it's trying to hit those deadlines every single week.
Got it. And how far out are you planning the content for that you end up publishing, like in terms of ideas and whatnot? Mm-hmm. You have the structure now in place, but is it a couple weeks in advance that hey, I'm going to be publishing this particular story on this YouTube or on this podcast or on this media business? Yeah.
So for the long form case studies that are the podcast interviews plus the articles, I'm just recording those as we go along. So I'll have several of those recorded at a time. So it's never like I'm recording one of those the day before, they go live. And so in that case, I know in advance probably what I'm going to write about, which next case study I'm going to be working on, because that's the next one that I've chronologically recorded an interview for. And so those are definitely planned out in advance, or at least I know in advance what it's going to be about. In terms of the newsletter, I mean, it's really just, I usually write the newsletters on Tuesday and then send them out on Wednesday. It's really what I decide I'm going to write about that day. Sometimes it's something that's going on in the news. I also offer to paid subscribers this kind of Q&A feature where they can ask me questions that they want me to answer in the newsletter. So I'll use those as story prompts. But, I usually don't know what I'm going to write about in the newsletter until that Tuesday. Every now and then I'll know, Gotcha. I'll know by Monday, I'll see something. Like a few weeks ago before I went on vacation, there was a big Bloomberg piece about Spotify and its podcast efforts that I had read on a Monday. I was like, no, I think I'm going to devote a newsletter to this. So I knew a little bit, but no, I don't know. For the newsletter itself, I don't know that far in advance what I'm going to write about.
Gotcha. And you mentioned there that you had gone on a vacation for a little bit. How do you plan out your own breaks? Because that's one thing that I think can be a struggle for many independent creators and publishers is knowing when to actually stop and take a moment to breathe.
Yeah, I mean, for that case, I knew it was around 4th of July. It's a trip I take every 4th of July to Hill Country, Texas. So when I was creating the spreadsheet of the availability for sponsorships, I made sure to block that out as not available. And I think in the future, I'm either going to do that or I'm going to create kind of like filler Q&A interviews where I can, I now have like a very strong network of like successful media entrepreneurs that I know who are subscribers to my newsletter. So if, let's say I know it on the week of November 15th, I'm going to be on vacation or something like that. So like 2 or 3 weeks before, I might reach out to a media entrepreneur and be like, hey, can I send you some questions over email? And you can answer me about like building your media business. And then that takes a lot of work off my plate in terms of them, just answering the Q&A. And then I could write a short intro and then I can prep all that. So all I have to do is just push publish on that Wednesday, but don't actually have to work all that week. So that's how I'm kind of thinking around vacations of like having filler content that's still pretty decent and meaty and has like really good actionable insights, but I don't have to put as much work in advance so that it's ready to go, while I'm on that vacation or when I'm taking that break.
Got it. Now, I'm curious too about just building that network of people that you know within the creator economy industry, media business, all of that. Tell me about how you've been able to, I guess, like book your podcasts and find interviews, find people to actually give you the time of day to chat with you, because I imagine that can be very time consuming, especially just doing the outreach. I mean, I've done it myself for this podcast, sending out tons of emails to people, sometimes cold with no existing relationship. So I'm kind of curious about what your process looks like in that regard.
So this is really awesome, and this is something I'm really proud about. I haven't had to do cold outreach for my podcast in well over a year. I've created such a good feedback loop with my newsletter where I have so many media entrepreneurs reaching out to me to just like either they become paid subscribers or they reply to my newsletter and tell me a little bit about theirs, that I don't have to send out any cold pitches at all. It's all based on my personal interactions with my readership, people who already listen to my podcast, people who already read my newsletter. And that's great for a couple reasons. One, I don't have to spend a lot of time doing cold outreach. Two, the person who's coming on, they're excited to come on. They know who I am. Mm-hmm. And they know what the format of the show is. They know what I'm going to be asking them. I don't have to go through an annoying PR person. I hate working with PR people in terms of like booking interviews and stuff like that. In fact, I don't work with them at all anymore. Like I get tons of pitches for people to come on my show from like outside PR agencies. I don't even answer them. 100% of my guests are people who either read my newsletter or listen to my podcast, or there was a warm introduction made between someone who reads my newsletter, listens to my podcast, and someone they know and trusted, like introduced them to me. And so that's been great in terms of always having guests and not having to go out cold pitching people. It's also what was I going to say? Oh, so in terms of like my process is like once I think someone might be a good guest, but I don't know for sure because I don't know what our chemistry is going to be or how they sound or if their story, I might only have like a little bit of their story. I don't know how mature their business is. Then I always do a pre-interview with every guest. I never go in cold to an interview. So it's usually just a half-hour phone call where I take notes and I just hear about their business. I tell them it's on background. Nothing they're going to say during that phone call is going to be quoted or anything like that. And we just walk through their business and they tell me about it. And then that's great because when I go to come up with the questions later, I just go into that Google Doc where I took all those notes and then I'm able to like pull out different things and think of, basically create like a list of topics that I want to hit upon in the interview itself. So that's been great for that process. It's also a good opportunity for them to ask any questions of me or explain the process of, the production. Like you use Riverside, I use Squadcast. So that way I'm able to explain to them how Squadcast works and all the logistics there. So, doing that pre-interview has been a game changer for me in terms of improving the interview. Like I don't sit there and just read questions, but because I have the questions there as kind of like a guideline, I'm able to like keep the thing going. And it sounds like I've done my research going into the interview and I'm not just going in cold.
Exactly. Yeah, you want to keep it as organic as possible. I mean, even right now, like I have my list of questions here for you, then I've hit on a couple of them, but as the conversation goes on, there are certain things that you say that pique my interest that I didn't may not have prepared for, but you have to like hone in on that. And I think that's where being an active listener as a podcast host definitely helps.
And I think that's why a lot of podcast hosts, they're like who are launching new podcasts, are like, oh, how hard could it be to just interview someone? I can always tell when I'm going on someone's podcast who doesn't have a lot of experience with it, because they're basically just reading questions, and then like they'll read me a question, I'll answer, and then they won't respond to anything I said. They'll just like read the next question, and it's a learned skill. But I've been a journalist for now close to 15 years. So I know how to conduct an interview, basically.
Yeah. There is have you ever listened to Tyler Cohen's podcast, Conversations with Tyler? He works for the Mercatus Center, I believe, at what school is that? George Mason University. George Mason,
yeah. Yeah, so I have like listened to snippets of that podcast. I'm familiar with him going back years. He has a long-standing econ blog called Marginal Revolution. So
yes,
I know who Tyler is, but I'm not a regular listener to his podcast.
The reason I bring him up, I think that I haven't listened to his podcast in a while, but I think that Tyler Cohen might be the only podcast host who I've heard that gets away with that. Because it seems like when he interviews people, he just goes down a list. Like he'll ask a question, and then the next question he asks won't even have anything to do with the previous question that he asked, but it just works for him for whatever reason. I think it's just because he's able to keep the flow of the conversation going, or maybe because he asks a question so quickly that the guest doesn't really have much time to think about what happened in the previous question. But that's the only guy who I know who's seen that work.
Well, his podcast recently went viral because I don't know if you saw this, but he tripped up Mark Andreessen for about
the Web3
stuff. Yeah, tripped him up in terms of explaining the practical application. So he does ask, I guess, at least in that instance, he seemed to be asking follow-up questions that pressed Andreessen to like actually give real answers.
Yes. I think, did you write about that in one of your recent newsletters about just some of the a lot of the people who are championing Web3 and you have your skepticism about it, and how quite a few of them, people like Mark Andreessen, I think, Patty Galloway, Not Boring newsletter, just really have, and this is no slight at them, but when you actually try to dive in deeper into what is the actual value and use cases of this in the real world, they're kind of stumped when it comes to talking about it. And which brings me to like a point here in this conversation that like I'm kind of curious about like where you think things are headed in that direction with using blockchain and Web3 in the creator economy, because a lot of people seem to suggest that there's a lot of promise there.
I mean, I think basically in a few years, we're going to talk about Web3 in the same way that we talk about Beanie Babies, like this bubble that everybody talked about had some kind of intrinsic value, but really ended up being completely a bubble. I think I'm not going to pretend like I know every single technical detail behind Web3, but I've followed it enough to see a mirage, to see that a lot of the things that they claim they're doing, they're not really doing, or they're not doing as well as, they're not improving upon current technologies. the thing that Web3 does is the thing that every kind of blockchain crypto product does is it creates basically digital assets that can be resold, which is pretty freaking cool. Like the trick of Bitcoin, the trick of the blockchain is a pretty neat trick because nobody else accomplished that before. But all these other claims that it makes about how it decentralizes the web, how it lets you own your own content, that it somehow is a better for, selling access to communities or live events or, all kinds of things like that, I think is just complete, BS. And if you drill down and actually ask them questions about why this is better than, startup X is better than this already existing platform that isn't based on the blockchain, it doesn't hold up to much scrutiny.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I mean, I'm very intrigued with what the future holds with the technology of blockchain in general, but of course we've gone through this big boom period over the last few years, even with the creator economy. I mean, just how things have kind of grown there and all the opportunities for people to make revenue. And now we're entering a period of recession here globally, and we'll see. I mean, recessions are always a chance to kind of wash away the opportunities that don't necessarily have much value and reveal the ones that do. So I guess we'll just kind of have to see what happens in several years from now. But I want to dive back into just again your business of running your newsletter. What tools do you use? Aside, we know that you use Substack for your newsletter, but what does like your tech stack look like in terms of being able to manage everything that you do as an independent publisher?
I mean, it's a lot of Google Sheets, a lot of Google Docs, Substack for the newsletter. Stripe is integrated through Substack. Stripe is the main payment platform that you're using to collect credit card info. In terms of hosting the podcast, I use Libsyn, which is a paid podcast host. In terms of editing my podcast, I use Audacity, which is like a free open source audio editor. In terms of editing the video, which I don't do much right now because there's only really an audio component, but I'm going to start having video versions of my podcast. I use something called Wondershare. If you're a hardcore video editor, you probably wouldn't use that. You specialize in video, right?
Yes, we do.
So you probably are using what's the hardcore?
We have Adobe Premiere.
Yeah.
Adobe Premiere. Yeah. It's either like Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro is usually the
So I'm not that advanced. What other things? I mean, I use Hootsuite to schedule out my social media posts each week. Although what they're like doubling the price of their SaaS price, so I'm probably going to switch to Buffer. Squarespace to host my website. Trying to think of what other things are within my tech stack. Instapaper, that's how I use all the industry news that I, curate in the newsletter and social media accounts. I use Instapaper. I'm really into using I don't know if you're a member of my Facebook group, but I have a private Facebook group for subscribers. Yeah. That's been a lot of fun. People shit on Facebook, but their Facebook group technology is actually pretty good in terms of fostering discussion and stuff like that. I'm sure I'm missing a lot. I actually pay to subscribe. I put my money where my mouth is. I actually pay to subscribe to a lot of media outlets, that I, curate for the newsletter and Facebook group. That's all that's coming to mind now.
Yeah. No, and speaking of your community, your Facebook group, it's great. I mean, I think there is something to that, what you're talking about in terms of the usefulness of it, because as much as, like you said, as much as people are down on Facebook right now, there's still a lot of people using Facebook. Like I still begrudgingly log on to my Facebook because of contacting people through Messenger. But I will say this about groups on Facebook, especially the ones that you're interested in. I mean, you get served content from those groups, and it reminds you that you're a member of those groups. Like I see posts that you share in your Facebook group pretty much every time I log into Facebook, because I guess the Facebook algorithm has learned that I am more likely to engage with this content from your group than anything else that they could deliver to me. So versus like, say, having, of course, like these platforms like Discord are great, but they don't have like there's no like distribution mechanism in Discord to remind you like that you're a part of these groups, which is why sometimes I end up like inactive in most of the Discord groups I join.
And that's why I get criticisms, because there's always those Facebook haters out there, and they're always like, well, why don't you host it on Slack, or why don't you host it in Discord? It's just like, because most people like log into Facebook every day, and not a lot of people log into Discord every day. And so if they're already going into Facebook and it's already showing up in their feed, that's the place I want to be, is in an already existing feed.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in terms of creating content and sharing content in the group, like, is there a minimum amount of posts that you try to hit on like a daily or weekly basis, or is it just kind of come as it goes? Like, hey, this is interesting, I think the group would like it, let me just throw it up there.
Yeah, I would say that like my litmus test is, do I find this interesting? Do I think my group would find it interesting? Do I have like maybe something slightly interesting to say about it? Even if it's just a sentence or two of like a little bit of extra commentary, a little bit of extra flavor that will get people chatting. The most successful Facebook posts, in terms of, you can't see the metrics, but I can see the metrics on my Facebook group, in terms that are seen by the most people, are the ones where a lot of people either click on the link or people comment. So I love, and I try to be I always try to be responsive to anybody who comments on anything I do on social media. But Facebook, I am super vigilant. I try my best to answer every single comment that shows up in a Facebook post, and just respond to it. It doesn't take that much extra time, and just try to I'm just trying to foster discussion in that group and give my readers personal access to me. So that's why I'm like so responsive in that Facebook group, because I'm just trying to train the algorithm that this is a very highly engaged, group, and hopefully that results in people seeing the content more often.
Right, definitely. Well, let's talk more about just growing your audience in general. I'm kind of curious, like, how you've been able to sustainably just grow your following and your subscriber base on Substack, which I'm sure, again, you're funneling those followers to the other platforms that you are active on.
Mm-hmm. So I don't do any like standard growth hacks for newsletters. Like I get like other newsletter writers reach out to me all the time, and they're like, oh, let's do a recommendation swap. Or basically I would recommend their newsletter, they would recommend mine. I don't have anything against other newsletters to do this, but I just like, I'm so like pure, like such a purist in terms of what I recommend to my readership, that I don't want to recommend them a newsletter that I don't read every day just because they're recommending them to me. So I don't do any kind of recommendation swaps. I don't do referral programs. So, where if you refer 10 friends, you get a free coffee mug or anything like that. It's all 100% organic. It's me trying to create really good content that people want to share, either by forwarding the newsletter or by coming into it through Google, or sharing it on social media. And of course, I follow, social media best practices in terms of scheduling out tweets and Facebook posts, and trying to create feedback loops where people are joining my Facebook group, and then I'm using that to share the newsletter and stuff like that. Also, one of my biggest growth areas is I just interview a lot of influential, very successful media entrepreneurs who have really large followings on social media. And I try to do such a good job interviewing them and writing like a really detailed long form case study that they will share it to their Instagram account that has 100,000 followers, or their their Twitter account, which has tens of thousands of followers, or share it within their own newsletter. So just like, I'm just trying to create like really great organic content, interview influential people who have like strong social media followings. And it's been completely organic. And I will say that, I don't know if you know about this, but Substack created this recommendations feature and launched it back in like March, I want to say. And it basically allows other Substack writers to create kind of like a blog roll where if you sign up for their newsletter, it then recommends all the newsletters that they've listed as recommending. So they get to, it's not generated by an algorithm or anything like that. Like they have to opt in terms of recommending the newsletters. And I've been really fortunate that because I write about the newsletter economy and the creator economy, that a lot of newsletters on Substack have recommended me. And that's like supercharged my growth in terms of new subscribers.
What made you decide to focus on not just say the creator economy, but also just the media business at large? Because that's quite like a wide scale of media coverage to focus on.
Because I think like it's, even though it's wide, there's so much you can learn from both sides. Like there's so much that media companies can learn from the creator economy and how, because like the creators are like, they have to build their audience from scratch. They have to monetize from scratch. There's so much like entrepreneurial grit and innovation that's happening in the creator economy. And I think if you work at the New York Times or the BBC or NPR, there's a ton you can learn from the creator economy about how to get to create better content, get it distributed better, monetize it better, and then vice versa. Like a lot of these creators are starting out, like they're one-man media companies basically. Mm-hmm. And so there's so much institutional knowledge that's happening up, at the Wall Street Journals, the New York Times of the world that can filter down and be utilized and leveraged by creators. So I think there's like a ton of synergy between those two. And that if you're an executive at, the Financial Times, or if you're a podcaster who's just starting out and who's only published a few episodes, I think you can learn a lot from hearing about both sides of that coin.
Now, how do you feel about, or how do you go about keeping the coverage fresh? I mean, do you ever find at times, because you've done so many interviews and talked to a lot of media entrepreneurs, both from the traditional side and also the creator side, that you find a lot of these like commonalities in terms of ideas, like core ideas, like maybe the idea of diversifying revenue? Like a lot of people talk about that when it comes to building a creator business. So I guess, how do you go about keeping things fresh for yourself, where you don't feel like you're just kind of rehashing the same core ideas, but just through a different story lens?
The awesome thing about the creator economy and the media industry in general is there's just so many people. It's just like, people talk about like supposedly the media industry is in decline. I think it's like the most vibrant that it's ever been. And there's just so many, like, you should see my inbox and these people who read my newsletter and reach out to me wanting to be interviewed and stuff like that. Like, every single creator journey is slightly different. Every media company is slightly different, in their strategy, is going on a different trajectory and figuring out things. And it's like, it's just fun to like unpack how they built their media businesses and basically reverse engineer it. And I think, every single time I do a different interview, I learn something new, or I think about something in a different way. I don't think it's cookie cutter at all in terms of, and then it's not just the strategies themselves, but like strategies within different niches. Like, I had on my podcast this woman who is an art buying consultant, and but she built her business. She built her business through starting with a blog, and then grew a huge Instagram following, and then launched online courses, and then wrote a book. Like, it's just like so many different paths that people take across so many different niches and industry and stuff like that. And I think it will always be fascinating, and there will always be more creators for me to interview.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, I mean, on a related note, in terms of your own ways that you've been generating revenue and building this business out for yourself is, you mentioned the woman who launched her own online course, but you recently did a course, but it was in collaboration with the University of Oregon, which is very different than, I think, like a lot of creators. They may be like, you've seen bigger creators, they've landed brand deals essentially, or partnership deals with companies like Skillshare, but you managed to do this with a recognized educational institution. And so I'm kind of curious about how that opportunity came about for yourself, and what it looked like to design that curriculum.
Well, just like with the podcast and a lot of other opportunities that come my way, it was like 100% organic. Ed Madison, who's a professor at the University of Oregon Journalism School, he was a reader of my newsletter and listener to my podcast, and he reached out. You know, he said that the University of Oregon's been looking to experiment with online courses that are, you know, separate from the main curriculum and course load of the university, and he wanted to kind of partner with me to work on that. And that there were a couple advantages of it. One, I had access to the prestige and marketing of a university, which is that imprimatur is so important in terms of convincing people who are going to shell out $800, which is what we ended up charging, to say, okay, I'm actually, this is worth investing in because the University of Oregon Journalism School is behind this. It also allowed me to basically pay our speakers. So the way that we ended up on was like almost like an extension of my podcast, in the sense of, me and then the other two journalism professors who were doing it, we would act almost as like hosts, where it was like a Q&A format where we would get these like really accomplished, really successful media entrepreneurs, media operators, and bring them in like a panel like discussion and, you know, interview them live, but then also bring in the students who themselves were very successful journalists and media operators themselves. So these weren't like freshmen in college. These were people who, you know, actually worked in the media world. And so basically we just settled on topics like building a video strategy, building a podcast strategy, building a newsletter, building a local news operation. And then we went out and we found the best people, the most successful people in each of those categories. And then, you know, for 10 weeks straight, we had 10 different sessions hosted live Q&As with the guests, but then also active discussion with it. So it was kind of like it wasn't like a lecturer, just me sitting up and lecturing them. It was, let's have an open discussion. Let's bring on real experts. It's basically taking, you know, everything I do with the podcast, but making it live and interactive.
And so how long did it take to plan that out and then eventually launch it?
Well, we launched it in like, I think late April.
It was 10 weeks, right?
Sometime
it was like April,
10 weeks.
April to June or so.
Yeah, something like that. We probably started in the fall of 2021, but it wasn't like we were constantly working on it. It was like, to start out, it was just like a weekly phone call where we kind of talked about the curriculum, and then we made a list of guest speakers. And of course, the hardest part of that is we wanted to have, diverse set of speakers. Like, we didn't want a single session to have all white males be the speakers. So we had to figure out, you know, oh, we have too many white males here. We need to find a female or a person of color. So really kind of creating this spreadsheet of who could speak out to. And then I did most of the outreach, because a lot of these people were people I had already interviewed. So reaching out to them, explaining the format, you know, telling them the date, telling them what the honorarium was going to be, all that kind of stuff. So it was a lot of logistical stuff. But, you know, altogether, it wasn't that time consuming. It was probably like combined maybe 40 to 50 hours worth of planning ahead of time.
Gotcha. And then if you can, I don't know if you are able to maybe like go into the details of like the rev share on it, but like what did that end up looking like in terms of, you know, what your cut looked like, what the university's cut looked like in terms of the profits that were generated from it?
Geez, I haven't looked at the contract in a while. I can't remember. It was I was going to get some percentage of the amount based on the amount of money based on the number of participants that we signed up, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what that was.
Got it.
We ended up selling, I think we had 20 students at the end. So that's what, like, it generated about $16,000 total. But I don't know off the top of my head what my revenue share was.
Gotcha.
I will say that, like, you know, it did kind of open my eyes of like, oh, I could probably do a lot of this on my own and take a bigger percentage on my own. And I always knew that online courses was like an option for me, but I was dragging my feet on it. But this kind of spurred me to take action and get confidence that this is something that I can do. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know for sure. But maybe in the future I might just do it myself, and then that way I can get 100% of the upside from it. So, but it was a cool experience. I don't
Yeah.
regret doing it or anything like that.
Yeah, no, and it's great because at least if you do it again, you have the cachet and credibility to say that I've done this before and I did it with an accredited institution in the University of Oregon, right? Like
Yeah.
that's a huge
Yeah.
benefit there.
Yeah, and I'll always be able to name check that I taught a course for the University of Oregon, which will always, not that I'm going to be applying for jobs anytime soon, but it's a good resume builder.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a good social proof for you again, like if you're building out your own like course product yourself, you can easily throw that in there in your marketing or sales copy for an online course that you sell.
Yeah, I think like ideally, I would love to like sometime in the future partner like with someone else to do it, like a Video Husky or something like that, where like, okay, let's create a course together. And, something that agency or that company has expertise in. And like, let's do a whole thing about like video creation, and like, we'll get like really kick-ass video creators and as guests, and we'll interview them and create a course around that or something like that. I'm not saying I'll never do the University of Oregon thing again, but I'm just like, it's kind of opened my eyes of like, more strategic things I could do where I could maybe take in more of the revenue and see more of the upside and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's switch gears here onto something else related to generating revenue for yourself as a creator. And this is how we connected because we ran ads on your newsletter and podcast. I'm just really curious about how long you toyed with the idea before actually taking the leap and saying, let's start selling ads on my newsletter and podcast.
How long did I toy with the idea? I will say that I made the decision well before I actually did it.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started, there weren't like, it was early in kind of the newsletter creator economy where most of the successful case studies about, solo editorial newsletters was focused around these really successful paid subscription products like, Ben Thompson of Stratechery, Nick Qua of Hot Pod. Mm-hmm. So like, I kind of assumed going in that was the only available way for a newsletter creator to make money. I knew you could also do like ebooks and stuff like that, but I just knew it had to be paid products. And I didn't really consider at first that advertising would be a good revenue generator because I always thought of advertising as a scale product. Like the reason that paid subscriptions had so much allure for newsletter creators is they didn't have to reach massive scale in order to get to their 1,000 true fans. But what I then started to see by seeing other Substack newsletters kind of experiment with it, that there actually was like a lot of value in newsletter advertising because especially if you had a niche audience, because you could sell, exclusive access to a very engaged audience. So that really started to open my eyes to like, oh, well, actually, I don't need massive scale in order to make like, decent money from advertising. And so I probably and I was also growing frustrated with the paid subscription side because once you grow to a certain level, then the churn starts, kicking in and then you start seeing your growth just plateau and it just like kind of only starts inching up. And I could just see, wasting so much of my time, creating paid content that wasn't helping me to grow my email list. Because remember, every time you're putting out a paid newsletter, that's not helping you grow your audience whatsoever.
Yeah, it's only exclusive to the people who are already subscribed.
Yeah, so you start spinning your wheels pretty quickly. So starting in November, I decided to just do away with the paid component whatsoever and started trying to think of like, what are some other membership values that I could have that I could offer. I cut the price in half. So I went from charging $100 a year to $50 a year and then just focused on building my free list as much as possible. And then in March of 2022, after several months of planning and getting ready for it, that's when I announced, a sponsorship availability.
And so tell me about how you came to the prices that you offered for your newsletter. And I think since we advertised with you, you had raised prices.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about like, what that looked like, how you made that determination that this is what I value the cost to reach my audience at.
Yeah. So every single person who's advertised, or not every single, but a lot of my advertisers have booked an ad. And then after they book the ad, they say, by the way, you're charging a lot less than all your competitors. Like they've said, I've heard claims that my competitors are charging upwards of 10 times the amount that I'm charging, basically, which I'm okay with. Like, I want to be competitive. I like the way that I'm charging right now. Who knows? Maybe in the future I will charge more, but basically I'm charging at like $100 CPM. So for every 1,000 subscribers I have, I'm charging $100. Is basically, that's the kind of simplicity. How did I arrive at that number? I don't know. It's a nice, clean number. I can also kind of project into the future, like as I grow my newsletter, like, once it gets up to, say 20,000 subscribers, this is what I can charge and stuff like that. And it also allows me to just kind of gradually continue to increase the prices as my audience gets larger. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. It definitely does. Are there any other products or things that you have in the works to maybe like monetize or leverage your audience into monetization?
Yeah, I mean, so there's like, I have done consulting in the past. I've kind of phased that out. That was my main way of monetizing. Is there some way where I could do kind of like, access to me on a weekly phone call where I could give you general advice where it's not taking up too much of my time? Like if, for $500 a month, we can do 2 phone calls a month where I can talk through general strategy with you. Can I take my case studies and repackage them as ebooks? Can I take my podcast interviews, repackage them as online courses? One thing that I have not exploited at all is things like speaking. So especially as like in a post-COVID environment, as things open up, could I charge a lot of money for brands that want me to come either in person or through like Zoom and talk to their staff about content strategy?
I could even see you, Simon, being like a moderator. For
stuff like that.
Conferences, like where maybe you're interviewing some like a media executive or something like that and moderating like a conversation.
So one thing I started brainstorming over 4th of July, and this is why it's good to take a vacation so your ideas can start percolating, is what if I did kind of sponsored Q&As where let's say Video Husky, you have me interview you, as an expert on video creation on some subtopic within video creation. Then you publish that interview to your website. And then I run a standard ad within my newsletter that will link to that interview. So not only are you getting the standard ad unit, but more people are likely to click through because they like me and, what I do. So they're more likely to click on that link and land on that interview, land on the sponsor's website and spend a substantial amount of time reading that content. And it's a permanent piece of content that will, drive SEO and that you could use in your own marketing in the future. I think there could be like all sorts of benefits of doing that, of creating like, a native piece of content on the sponsor's website. And so I've been thinking, around a couple different ways that I could like, diversify and launch new products or new ad products and stuff like that.
That's cool. That's very cool. Well, one of the last things I want to talk to you about, we exchanged when we were exchanging emails about you coming on the podcast to do this was an article you wrote last month in June about when should a creator decide to throw in the towel. So I'm curious how many times have you considered doing this yourself?
I mean, there were some dark days for sure. And every creator, every startup founder, and I that's one of the things is I tell people to think about, like, too many people think about being a creator as like some kind of like standard 9-to-5 type of job, when in reality, you have to think of it as you're a one-man startup. And if you read a lot of literature in the startup community, you hear about the depression, you hear about the dark points, you hear about the times where the startup founder just thinks, I don't know how this business is going to succeed. I think they have like terms for it, like the valley of despair or something like that.
Oh, it's like, there's like the trough of something.
Yeah.
I've heard of this.
Yeah. And all of that stuff applies to the creator economy as well, as you go through that same trough. And so, yeah, I went through that trough as well. I mean, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm completely out of it. I'm still not making as much money as I did during my consulting days. And I know, and it's something I'm still, striving to get toward, but there's always going to be that doubt. So yeah, to answer your question, I thought about it a lot, about what am I going to do if this is not going to work out?
Yeah, I'm sure, like, and I just looked it up. I just looked it up on Google. It's the trough of sorrow.
Yeah.
It's like the whole process is like, when you get started, you have that initial peak where you're like so excited, you're creating stuff, you feel like you're energized, and then the novelty starts to wear off, and then you get to that trough of sorrow. And then there's like all these other like little peaks and valleys, but eventually you're trying to get to that point where you have it going on a upward trajectory. Yeah.
And you give credit to the tech startup community. They've been, especially over the last like 10, 15 years, they've been really good about educating, startup founders about this experience that they're going to go through, so they're prepared mentally. But I don't think that kind of education has happened within the creator economy. And so these aspiring creators are going into it all excited. They've read the interview with the guy who has 1 million YouTube subscribers, and they're like, that's going to be me. And they don't really know about the grind that they're signing themselves up for. And I think a lot of them are quitting because they just can't withstand that amount of despair, basically.
Yeah. And when I look at, and I think of some of the, these top creators today, obviously the one guy who always comes to mind for me is someone like Mr. Beast. And I look at him and I look at other people from other, other verticals or other industries. And the one common trait that I seem to notice in them is like this, almost like an unhealthy obsession with what they do. Like, you think of Mr. Beast and what he does with YouTube. He has like all bordering an unhealthy obsession with just trying to get better at YouTube. I mean, it's very similar to like Michael Jordan's obsession with wanting to be the best basketball player that he could have been when he was in his career. And so, but it's just trying to figure out, especially, these days, like, how can you do something as a creator that is just, it's sustainable for yourself. I've said that word so many times throughout this conversation, where, you're able to stick with it over the long haul and not necessarily get tired or burnt out from the process of it all.
Yeah, to speak to like Mr. Beast and also Marquez Brownlee and other famous YouTubers, you don't hear about them until they're famous. Like Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast and Marquez Brownlee, like, he's talked about this, like, he created like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and maybe even thousands of videos before he even reached like, his first like 10,000 subscribers. And so it really is about sustainability, like creating a schedule and a runway. I talk about this word runway, whether it's a financial runway or, it's figuring out a way that you can devote time during your free time outside of your job, things like that, where you can consistently make content on a regular basis and figuring out what that format, what that schedule looks like. And it really is about showing up over and over and over, not just creating content consistently, but learning from your mistakes, tweaking your strategy until you find something that works.
Cool. Well, Simon, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. It was a pleasure to have you on. And as we wrap up, why don't you let everybody know where they can go and find you on the internet? Yeah,
if you just Google my name, Simon Owens, you'll find basically all my places where you can sign up to follow me. My Substack is at simonowens.substack.com. And my podcast is called The Business of Content. You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts.
Cool. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Videocraft Show presented by Video Husky. As always, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on our YouTube channel, or find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. And make sure to leave us a review if you enjoyed this episode. We are always looking for feedback for how we can improve. Gotta go and thank my guy Gio Fernandez for all the work that he is doing producing this show, as well as Paulo Lopez on graphics. And just a reminder to all of you, if you are looking to get your videos edited to look just like this, then visit videohusky.com. to learn more. I'll see you next time on another episode of the Videocraft Show presented by Video Husky.